Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to be talking about an event that honestly shook America to its core. We're looking back at the Virginia Tech shooting, what happened on that day, and maybe more importantly, the legacy it left behind for all of us. So let's start with a single number, 32. 32. That's how many students and faculty members lost their lives on April 16, 2007. It's a staggering number, and at the time, it made this the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. It's a number we really need to keep in mind as we go through this.
Okay, so to really get our heads around what happened, we need to break it down. We're going to look at three things. First, the timeline of the attacks themselves, then we'll get into the history of the person responsible. And finally, we'll talk about the lasting impact this had on the entire country. So let's dive right in with the timeline.
All right, a tragedy in two acts. And that's really what it was. The violence didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in two totally separate phases, and they were separated by more than 2 hours. And that gap, well, it created a lot of confusion and, tragically, a kind of false sense of security on campus.
So check this out. The day kicks off just after 7 a.m. with an attack at a dorm. But then, silence. For over 2 hours, there's this bizarre, eerie lull. And what's happening during that time is just chilling. The shooter goes back to his room, changes his clothes, deletes his emails, and then actually goes to the post office to mail a package before starting a much deadlier attack on a completely different part of campus.
And this right here really breaks down that separation between the two attacks. You see, the first shooting at the dorm, the police thought it was an isolated domestic thing. A targeted event that was already over. And that assumption, that distinction, is absolutely critical because it's at the heart of all the criticism that came later about how the university handled things.
Okay, so inside Norris Hall, it was absolute chaos. The shooter had actually chained the main doors shut from the inside, trapping everyone. It's just horrifying to imagine. But, even in that terror, there were these moments of unbelievable heroism. You have Professor Liviu Librescu, a 76-year-old Holocaust survivor of all people, barricading his classroom door, giving his students time to jump out the windows. And then there's Cadet Matthew Laporte, a sophomore, who was killed while charging straight at the gunman. I mean, these people, they're true heroes who saved so many lives.
So the big question is, who did this? Who was the shooter, Seung-Hui Cho? And maybe more importantly, were there any warning signs? Well, after the fact, the investigation uncovered, let's just say, a long and very well-documented history of severe mental health issues. And this goes way back. I mean, all the way back to middle school. In 8th grade, he was diagnosed with severe depression and something called selective mutism. It's this really intense anxiety disorder that can literally make it impossible for a person to speak in certain situations. And he was getting therapy and special ed support for this all through middle and high school. But then he gets to college, and things really started to escalate. His professors were getting seriously concerned about his writings. They were violent, they were disturbing. He was even investigated for stalking 2 female students. It got so bad that in 2005, a court actually ordered him to get treatment. But here's the thing. Because of federal privacy laws, Virginia Tech had no idea about those earlier diagnoses from when he was a kid. The different systems just weren't talking to each other, so no one had the full picture.
Remember that package he mailed between the two attacks? Well, it went to NBC News, and inside was this whole multimedia manifesto, an 1,800-word rant, photos of him posing with guns, videos, the whole shebang. In it, he just rails against the wealthy, compares himself to Jesus Christ, and even calls the Columbine shooters martyrs. It was a really disturbing glimpse into his mindset.
So, once the dust settled, everyone was asking the same gut-wrenching question. Could this have been prevented? Or could the damage at least have been lessened? To try and find some answers, the state put together a special panel to investigate. This group, the Virginia Tech Review Panel, was told to look at everything from every possible angle, especially how the university responded. And let me tell you, their findings, they did not pull any punches.
And yeah, this table really gets to the heart of it. The panel's main conclusion was that the 2-hour delay in warning the campus, that was a massive, critical error. They said the police made a mistake by assuming the first shooting was just an isolated domestic incident. Now, they were very clear. Cho, and only Cho, was responsible for the violence. But they argued that serious flaws in judgment cost lives, and that a faster, clearer warning could have made a real difference.
Okay, so let's talk about what happened next. The shooting sent these
just incredible shockwaves, not just across the country, but around the entire world. And the response, both immediate and long-term, is something we're still feeling the effects of today.
I mean, the outpouring of support was just immense. Messages of condolence came in from over 80 countries, from every single U.S. state. The government of South Korea, since the shooter was a South Korean citizen, was especially vocal. They expressed deep condolences and even held public vigils. There was a real fear of a xenophobic backlash against Koreans living abroad. Back on campus, the university created something called the Hokie Spirit Memorial Fund, and people gave. It raised over $7 million. A big chunk of that money, about $3.2 million, was used to create 32 separate endowed scholarships, one in the name of each and every victim. It's a beautiful way to make sure they are never, ever forgotten at Virginia Tech.
But beyond the grief and the memorials, this tragedy did something else. It shined a massive spotlight on some really critical gaps in our laws, at both the state and federal level. And that exposure led directly to some of the biggest changes in American gun control we'd seen in more than a decade.
So get this. Investigators found this just shocking legal loophole. Remember how a court declared Cho mentally ill back in 2005? Well, because the judge ordered him to outpatient treatment, meaning he wasn't physically committed to a facility, his name wasn't required to be sent to the National Background Check System for Gun Purchases, the NICS. And that one little distinction, it meant he could walk into a store and legally buy the guns he used in the attack. It's unbelievable.
As you can imagine, that revelation led to immediate action. The governor of Virginia issued an executive order, basically overnight, to close that reporting gap in the state. And it didn't stop there. Pretty soon after, President George W. Bush signed a new federal law, a law that strengthened the entire national background check system by pushing states to improve their reporting so that people who'd been legally declared mentally ill couldn't buy guns.
You know, when you look back, the tragedy of Virginia Tech was a real turning point. It forced the entire country to take a hard look at these huge, glaring gaps in our mental health care system, in our privacy laws, and in our gun regulations. The changes that came out of it really highlight this incredibly complex, ongoing challenge we face. How do we keep our communities safe without stepping on individual rights? And honestly, that's a question we are all still trying to answer today.